Well, good morning. My name is David DeMora. I'm the Director of the National Initiatives Division at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The National Initiatives Division is made up of a number of programs, which include our reentry program, or our National Reentry Resource Center, as well as our mental health program, which includes our consensus project, and our courts program, which include a number of courts initiatives, from some pretrial initiatives through something that's called systems flow analysis, how folks get into a system, get stuck in a system, don't get out of a system, and what can be changed in terms of modifying that system to make it be more effective and more efficient, as well as at the other end in terms of working with reentry courts and, of course, with mental health courts. In addition, the other program in the National Division is our substance abuse program, which both works on its own projects and is really woven through all of the other parts of the programs in the National Initiatives Division. In addition to the work that we do with grantees, we have a number of various projects that we work on. I'm not going to go through all of them this morning just because of time, but would encourage you to take a look at them. Over the past year, we have been honing our focus in terms of looking at the issue of recidivism reduction. We have been honing our focus in terms of the direct need to correlate reentry work, employment work, all of the work that we do in reentry to the appropriate outcomes, to good recidivism reduction. This past December, we held a State Leaders Forum that was a national forum that had state leaders, state corrections directors, state champions from all 50 states met here in D.C. to talk about the issue of targeting recidivism reduction as a main goal within corrections systems. Now, that particular forum was for adults, but we have also begun to look at this and think of this in particular when we're talking about juveniles. And so over the course of the last year, we've begun to think about the issue of recidivism reduction and the risk needs responsivity model in terms of working with juveniles, which is what we're going to talk about some today. In fact, it is our goal that in about a year from now, it is our hope to be able to have a similar forum only for juveniles, with state leaders, state judicial leaders, state juvenile justice leaders from all 50 states to meet together to do something very similar to what occurred this past December and to really sort of develop a national drive to this focus on recidivism reduction and working with juveniles. Now, a couple of things. First of all, I don't want to suggest that there aren't many brilliant people out there that have been working on this, because there are. I also don't want to suggest that there aren't very many brilliant things that have been developed, because there have been. And in fact, Jen will talk a little bit about some of those things as she goes through this presentation. Having said that, what we want to talk about is this framework of the risk needs responsivity model and thinking about this in connection to how it is that we do planning and this sort of 5-step process that we want to talk about. Further, one of the reactions that happens a lot of times when we have this discussion is two things that tend to go on. One is a number of folks go, oh my goodness, that's all about adults. Well, there are certain principles that actually are similar in terms of what goes on with adults and what goes on with juveniles, but it's not all about adults. First of all, the original development, when they did the risk needs responsivity model and the original data, they actually were looking at the juvenile histories of the individuals, and a lot of people don't even realize that. So that's one issue. Second issue is just because principles may be valid across a spectrum, it doesn't mean you do the same thing. We all know that juveniles are not mini-me adult offenders. We all know that treating juveniles as adult offenders is dangerous. That is not what we need to do. But what we do know is that we need to have a better, more laser-like focus about responding to juveniles in a way that will both get them out of the systems that they get stuck in and keep them out of the systems that they get stuck in. And in order to do that, we're proposing some different ways of thinking about things that we all know we need to do. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing the important things we're currently doing with juveniles. It means how can we package it in a way that will get us to the end result? How can we take so many of the good things we're doing and do them even more effectively, if you will? And so this morning is about an introduction and discussion about some of those principles. And again, we don't have as much time as we had anticipated, but for an introduction we will get through that. And then we're happy to talk with folks about this afterward for a while. We also are at the very beginning of this journey. So in a sense, we're inviting you in at the relatively early stages of a journey as we begin to work on and figure this out. And we are doing this with a number of partners. We've had a number of initial meetings. We have a number of other meetings that we'll be developing. We've met with some people in this room. We'll be meeting with many others in this room over the course of the next months and years as we continue to work on this. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Pealer, and I will let her tell you about herself and her background, but is a woman who's very experienced both in working with juveniles and in working with risk, needs, and responsivity, has worked with Dr. Ed Latessa and many others in this area for a number of years. So, Jen?
Hi, I'm Jennifer. What we're going to talk about today is really research. I did work with Dr. Ed Latessa. I got my PhD from the University of Cincinnati, so I've worked with him for many years. But then after that, I sort of was the black sheep because I decided to leave academia and actually go and get my hands dirty in the real world. And so for 3 years, I was the assistant commissioner for the Juvenile Justice Authority in Kansas. And what I did there was actually 3 different areas. Love the job. Training for the staff, because we know that skill development is very, very important. And then also overseeing the research, so the data nerd got to play a little bit in the numbers. And then finally overseeing the programming for the kids that we had in the custody, but also providing programming for our community supervision officers. And so what we want to talk about today is looking at this research, but then more importantly framing it in this, how do we take this body of knowledge that we have and apply it when we're actually working with the kids. And what we have is these different levels of research. Lowest level is your gut feeling. How many times have people found out what you do and they're like, well, I can tell you how to fix those kids. What do they tell you?
Tough love.
Okay, tough love. What else do they tell you?
Discipline.
Discipline. Firm sticks. What else?
Lock them up.
Lock them up, exactly. Well, you know what? In a way, that is research, but that's like the lowest level of research. That's what your gut tells you. And we now know that sometimes our guts are not always right. And so from there, we go to the highest level of research, and that's what we're going to be presenting on today. What does the data actually tell us when it comes to changing the behaviors of the youth? And when we're looking at data, we can see that there's literature reviews, and that's where y'all remember when you're in school and you had to write a paper, what'd you do? Okay, research. You went to the library. Y'all remember the card catalogs? They're probably now in one of them in the Smithsonian Institute. Okay? But you go to the card catalogs, you get your books down, you'd read them, and then you'd form an opinion. That's research. But we've gotten a little bit better at that type of research now. What we look at now is this concept called a meta-analysis. Y'all heard of a meta-analysis? Yeah, it's not very friendly to actually try to understand. But in a nutshell, when we look at a meta-analysis, it's actually using a mathematical formula to summarize the data. And it gives us basically an effect size. Anybody here a baseball fan? Okay, so what's a batting average? You're a baseball fan. What's a batting average?
How often you get a hit per your at-bat?
Okay, so it's basically hits over at-bats, right? And it gives you a number, and the number tells you what?
Percentage.
Okay, it's a percentage. Basically, the higher the percentage, the better batter you are, and the more what?
More likely you're going to get hit.
The more money you can make, exactly. The more money you can make. Well, with the meta-analysis, it's sort of the same thing. It's looking at how much of a relationship this predictor, this variable is to an outcome. And usually the outcome that we're going to be interested in is looking at recidivism. So from all these studies, what do we know? Well, right now there's a couple of things. First and foremost, we cannot find a single article that's shown that punishment actually works to reduce recidivism. So these punishment-oriented programs, not very effective. Actually, it can make them worse. So we know that punishment doesn't work, and it can actually make them worse. We also know that programs do work. Y'all remember in the 1970s when Martinson put out his article, basically it said nothing works and it helped to close the door on correctional interventions. Well, now we know that good old Robert Martinson, there was some issues with some of his research. They went back and looked at it and they found that, you know, with those few and isolated exceptions, we can get reductions in recidivism. We're looking at those items, we're looking at the programs that actually are going to reduce recidivism. We now know that the average reduction is about 10%, but what's better than that is that there are some programs where you're actually reducing recidivism by 20, 30, 40%. Those are huge reductions in this concept of reducing the chances of someone going out and committing a new offense. So, what does the research tell us? We put it into 4 main areas. The first is what we call risk-need principles. What we're looking at here, we want to make sure that we use validated risk assessments. We are talking about the risk of reoffending, not necessarily the risk of violence. So, show of hands, how many of you all actually use some type of risk or need instrument? Okay. How many of you all maybe just do a clinical interview? How many of you all have validated your instrument? Okay, very good. We have some hands. Okay. So we want to make sure that we're using a valid risk needs assessment. Now the risk principle is going to tell us who we need to target. And we'll get to that in just a second. But first we got to look at why do we want to go and use classification instruments? A couple of main reasons. One, it reduces bias. Okay. So for example, I have a straight criminal justice background. If you were to tell me to go out and assess a youth or even an adult, what do you think I would be looking at? Criminal history. You know, when's the first time you ever got in trouble? You know, maybe not knowing the research, I may even look at the type of crime they committed. How many times they've been locked up. Whereas, let's say this gentleman right here, he may have a mental health background. What would he be looking at? He may be assessing mental health factors. And so there would be some biases in between the assessment process. So with the standardized classification instrument, it reduces those biases. It can also help in aiding any type of legal challenges. Why did you do what you did with somebody? Using a good assessment will tell you what you need to do with the kid that you have in front of you. Also, utilizing better resources. How many of y'all have plenty of money? What? You don't have plenty of money? Well, then you have to start making hard decisions. Who's going to get what? A good assessment will help you with that decision making. Also, it helps you keep track of the changes. What's going on? Is what you're doing with these kids actually making a difference in reducing their propensity to go out and reoffend? And then all of that can lead to enhanced public safety. Now that's why we want to use assessments, but at the same time, even the very best assessments, we see problems with them. Here's some of the problems that we usually see. Going across the country, working with both adults and the juveniles agencies. First, the assessments are not validated or normed. Now, you know, there's instruments out there, they're nationally validated, you have some norming on them, but at the same time, best practices indicates that even if you use one of those instruments, you should actually be validating it and norming it to your population. Now, when I asked how many people have an assessment, over the half of the room raised their hands. When I asked how many people validated and normed it, the number sort of dropped off. So we see that quite a bit. Also, we see this one a lot. You do the assessment, and then what happens to it? You put it in the file, and that's where it stays. And guess what? Everybody gets the exact same course of treatment throughout the duration. At least you're doing the assessment, but what we're hoping to do is that you actually use the assessment and you differentiate that type of treatment based upon what the assessment's telling you. And then another problem, errors occur. A lot of times that's due to lack of training or lack of quality assurance. And then sometimes the instrument may not reflect the organizational considerations. So those are some of the problems that we typically see when it comes to risk assessment. But now let's look at the actual factors that drive that person's level of risk. So let's look at the factors that research has now shown us to be important when we're trying to predict which kid's going to go out and reoffend. We have up here a list. These are pretty much called the major 8. Antisocial attitudes, peers, personality, a history of antisocial behavior, family criminality, family problems, education, employment, leisure activities, and then substance abuse. Working with the kids, do you all see a lot of these problems with your kids, with your population? What do you think you typically see the most? Antisocial attitudes, okay. What else do y'all see? Antisocial peers. Anything else? Okay, education's a problem. Substance abuse. Do you have problems with their families? All right, so you see a lot of these problems in your everyday work. When we look at attitudes, research has shown us that antisocial attitudes, pro-criminal thinking basically, is a huge risk factor for our population, for both juveniles and adults. Think about it. The way they think drives how they behave in a lot of times, correct? So when we're looking at antisocial attitudes, we know it's a major part in the theories of criminality, but it's only been recently that we started looking at this more in depth. Antisocial attitudes, we're looking at values, beliefs, rationalizations that support criminal behavior. What we think and believe affects what we do. Some examples of antisocial attitudes. We're looking at the negative expressions about the law. So when you're working with those kids, what are some of the things they tell you about the laws? Laws don't apply to me. What else? Laws are stupid. What else? They're not going to get caught. Also, you're looking at negative expressions about conventional institutions. How many times has a kid looked at you and said, I can make more money selling drugs than you make all year? And you're like, yeah. Now, we don't necessarily tell them that all the time, but that is true. But see, they have that negative attitude about honest, everyday work. Other examples, a lack of empathy or sensitivity towards others. What do they typically say to let you know they have a lack of empathy? Okay, they don't care. They really don't care. And sometimes you run across kids that truly do not care. So we know that these are all examples of some antisocial attitudes. We also have neutralizations or minimizations, denial of responsibility, denial of injury. They could have put someone else in the hospital, but guess what? It wasn't that bad. At least they're not dead. Okay? Denial of the victim, system bashing, and appealing to higher loyalties where they live by a different code. You see that a lot of times with the gang members. So how do you go about addressing these antisocial attitudes? Well, first you have to get the kids to identify their antisocial thinking. And we're going to get more in depth in this a little bit later. But you got to get them to identify that they have some risky thinking. We don't necessarily use the words antisocial with them. You've got some risky thinking going on. You got to get them to use some thought blockers. And then we got to get them to change that risky thinking. So we'll talk about some tools that we can use a little bit later on. But these are just general ways that we go about addressing the thinking. When we look at peers, we know that with the population that you all are dealing with, adolescents, it's usually described as a period where you actually sort of shy away from your family and friends become more important. Is that correct? Well, guess what? That's normal adolescent development. But what is so problematic when it comes to our population, who they're hanging around with? Who do they typically hang around with? Other delinquents, other kids who engage in criminal behavior. So that's a problem. But also what's problematic is that for some of the kids that we work with, not only do they have delinquent friends, that's the only people they hang around with. So there's this absence of pro-social associates, pro-social friends. Can you think of some kids that you've worked with that's all they have? Is there delinquent networks? Why is that so problematic? Why does that make them a little bit higher risk? Is because if they don't have any pro-social associates, then they will not have that opportunity for pro-social modeling. And so we know that delinquent peers, the absence of pro-social associates is problematic. It's based upon the theory of social learning, which is not always a theory specifically for criminal behavior. It's just a theory about how behavior is learned in general. We learn it through the interactions of others. We see it, we watch it in action, we mimic it, and then we get the reinforcements back. Now, how do we go about reducing peer associations? One of the things in Kansas, when we were actually rolling out a risk assessment, we wanted to make sure it was tied to their case plan. And we always talk about once after you've identified these factors, the ones that are most problematic should be dealt with on the case plan. It was hilarious. Every time we saw peer associations, what do you think they put on there to actually identify or to change peer associations? Okay, get new friends. What else? Don't hang around with who? Don't hang around with known criminals. I mean, that's pretty much a given on any type of court orders. And so we'd see that on the case management plan. You know, you can't hang around with little Johnny. You can't hang around with little Sarah. So we're restricting their associates. We also try to reduce or to set and enforce curfews and then say, hey, you can't go to X, Y, and Z place. That's well and good, but what do the kids usually do when they leave your office? They go do A, B, and C. What's a better way to actually try to reduce these peer associations is to make sure that the kids have skills so that they can get new friends, to make sure that they have skills so that they can avoid the old friends. So we're teaching the youth to recognize and avoid negative influences, getting them to practice new skills in a way so that they're going to be comfortable using it when they're outside of our offices. We're going to teach them to maintain relationships without getting in trouble, because at the same time, you know, I can say, hey, don't hang around so-and-so, but guess what? So-and-so may be a family member. So I have to make sure that that kid that's in front of me, that youth, actually has the skills that if they have to hang out with so-and-so, that they can make better decisions. Train family and friends to assist the youth. Set new goal of a friend per month. But you can't just say that unless you actually teach the kids skills so that they can make good friends with those pro-social individuals. And then develop pro-social leisure activities. And we'll talk about skill building a little bit later on, but you can see that skills are going to be very, very important when we're actually targeting these factors. When we're looking at antisocial personality patterns, we're not talking about the DSM-4. We're talking about what type of skills does this individual possess, or what type of skills do they actually lack. For example, weak socialization skills. So think about the kids that you typically work with. When they are introduced to someone, do they look them in the eye, or do they happen to look down? Do they know how to make a proper introduction? Usually, a lot of them, probably not. So they have these weak socialization skills. Also, are they very impulsive? Do they have the ability to stop and think? Some do, some don't. Also, very restless or aggressive energy. They have a taste for risk. Below average verbal intelligence. They have very poor problem-solving skills, poor self-regulation skills, maybe very egocentric. Okay? So what we're looking at there is that the kid that maybe has too much self-esteem, that thinks that they're all that. And then they have a lack of empathy. So really what we're talking about in this concept of antisocial personality, really looking at skills. What type of skills do we need to work with to actually reduce that kid's chances of going out and reoffending? How do we address this? Again, it's going to be skill building. Giving them anger control skills, impulse control, decision-making, problem-solving, thinking skills. But it's not just saying, hey, here, you need to do this better, but there's certain techniques that we now know work better when actually trying to teach skills to the youth. Another very important risk factor is the history of antisocial behavior. We know that the single best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. But there's certain things that we look at when it comes to criminal history. One of the things is age of onset. 40% of serious offenders had committed their first offense by the age of 12. 85% had committed their first offense by the age of 14. So usually the younger they are, the more likely they will reoffend without proper interventions. But you're working with them, teaching them skills, reinforcing daily. So also, variety of the act. So if you have a kid who engages in multiple antisocial behavior, it's going to inflate their risk just a little bit, be more likely to reoffend. And then across settings. So if they engage in antisocial behavior at home, at school, in the neighborhood, on the bus, more likely to reoffend than someone who just acts out at home. Now you'll notice, I really don't have any way to deal with the history of antisocial behavior. You know why? By the time they get to me, it's static. I can't do anything about it. But remember, what we're talking about is trying to identify who we want to target. And we want to target those higher risk individuals, those higher risk youth. So we really can't do anything about it. It's static, it can't change. The next factor is family factors. What we know about family factors in criminality, it's going to include parental criminality. So if their parents engaged in criminal behavior, it is a risk factor. But really more important for our purposes are things that we can actually change, and this is going to include parental practices. And this is where it's a little bit different than the adults. Because, you know, we have to deal, if we want to be effective in reducing the recidivism, we have to deal with the family of these kids. We have to actually work and train the parents of the kids. Recognition of antisocial behaviors. A lot of times they may not know that we shouldn't let little Johnny do X, Y, and Z. So we have to teach them to identify antisocial behavior. We have to actually teach them how to supervise the kids correctly. It's not appropriate for a 13, 14-year-old to be out at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay? Also, discipline. Two extremes. There's either none, or there's too much, or it's very inconsistent. So we have to teach them how to discipline, and then also an issue of neglect and abuse. So we're looking at the parental practices within the family, and then also you're looking at the levels of affection, care, and cohesiveness. So how do you address these family factors? Family counseling, of course, to repair relationships, working with the parents to identify antisocial behavior, enhance supervision practices, and also how to discipline effectively. Education and employment is also another huge major risk factor. What we're looking at here, why is that so important? How many hours are they supposed to be in school? Usually about 6. Do you know when a large amount of crime occurs? Right after school. Okay? So if you think about it, education keeps them occupied for a long period of time. Now there's still a problem when they get out of school, though, that we want to address. But education employment takes up time. Outside of just the idle hands concept, though, getting an education, life course development, it's education, better career. We know that there is the correlation with that. And so it helps them what they call cumulative advantage, not disadvantage yet, but cumulative advantage, if they stay on that appropriate life course. So basically what that means is that it provides them with reinforcements. Theoretically, it's supposed to provide them with reinforcements. Now, the kids that we work with, do they get reinforcements from school? They usually get reinforcements, but they're what? Usually consequences or sanctions. They don't see going to school and getting a degree as a reward in and of itself, do they? Very few actually do. I don't blame them. Like when I was going through my PhD program, we got a reading list one time, and it was like 20-some books, and it seemed like 1,000,000 articles. And our professor, who shall remain nameless, says, "Pay me now, pay me later." Now, my antisocial way of thinking, had a few antisocial thoughts run through my mind, but now that you have the degree, it's like, okay, you can see the reward, but at the time I'm like, you know what? I would rather go watch a basketball game or a baseball game or, quite frankly, a football game versus sitting there and reading all those articles. But it's that concept of doing the work and getting the reinforcements, getting the rewards. Also, school puts them in contact with pro-social others. So they're hopefully in school. They have the opportunity to have that pro-social engagement with others. And so again, going back to the peers, you see where a lot of these risk factors intertwine with each other. What we're looking at, if we have kids who do not engage in education, it usually puts them in what we call cumulative disadvantage. So it knives off opportunities for them to be successful in the future. So we know that education is vastly important. Now you notice I didn't talk a whole lot about employment. How many times when people find out what you do, it's like, all you have to do is get a kid a job. How many times you all heard that? Well, guess what? We now know that even for the adult offenders, just getting them a job's not enough. And even with kids, when we look at the research on juvenile employment, kids who actually engage in employment sometimes too soon, more likely to what? Use drugs, and more likely to engage in delinquency. So, education, important. Employment, important later on. Leisure and recreation. Again, it's a major risk factor. What we're looking at is making sure that they're engaged in pro-social leisure activities. Usually these kids, though, that we work with are not engaged in pro-social leisure activities. They have too much time on their hands. What do they do all day? Play video games until their friends wake up, and then what? Just go out, cruise around, walk around. So we want to make sure that we're targeting those factors. And then substance abuse. Why is substance abuse illegal? First, the act in and of itself is illegal. But also outside of that, using drugs puts them into interactions with other delinquents, whether it's adult offenders or juvenile offenders. And so that interaction may lead to engage in criminal behavior. But also the use of drugs may lead them to engage in criminal behavior. How many times when you talk to a kid, why'd you do it? What do they say? They were high at the time. And then also, lastly, buying or selling drugs creates an environment that's also conducive of criminal behavior. Have you all had any kids or worked with any kids on your caseload that perhaps, you know, they know someone or maybe even one of the kids on your caseload has been seriously injured because of a drug deal gone bad? So we know that substance abuse, not only is illegal, it puts them into contact with delinquent others. And then there's a whole host of antisocial behaviors related to that. So those are the factors that we want to make sure that we're looking at when we're trying to determine who are we going to be working with. The second principle, supervision strategy, should really correspond with the risk of recidivism. Now, what does that mean? Because, you know, it sounds really easy to do, and I'm going to tell you right now, it is not that easy everyday, day-to-day operations. What we're looking at, we want to make sure that for our higher risk kids, so the kids that have a lot more of those problems that we just talked about, they need more supervision and more programming. It has to be both. Why? Because when we're looking at supervision, think about that as being those external controls. Programming is going to be working on the internal controls. So I'm going to be teaching them skills, various skills, so that they can develop that internal control while we have the external control on them as well. What does that actually mean? Kids who have a higher risk for going out and committing a new offense should receive more intensive services for a longer period of time. But there's still a caveat on that. We shouldn't be working with the kids. We're looking at 6 to 9 months in programming. Usually not over 12 months, because then you typically get diminished returns. Okay, you can sometimes make them worse. Basically, that's what that means. Juveniles with the lower risk have fewer problems and do not require intensive supervision. But what does that mean? It sounds well and good, but what does it mean on a day-to-day basis? What we're looking at, these lower risk kids, Keep them separate. How many of y'all work in a residential type of setting? All right, especially for the residential people. You've got low risk and you've got high risk. If you accept both, you want to make sure that your lower risk kids are kept separate from the higher risk kids. Why? For the very same reason you probably don't let your kids associate with delinquents. Your own personal kids associate with delinquents. That transference can occur, and we usually see the lower risk kids get worse. So keep them separate in the residential settings and in groups. Now, for how many of y'all working in a community setting? What does that mean for you all? Don't put your low-risk kids in with your high-risk kids in the group. Like, even though you might say, hey, you know, Jennifer, they're only there for an hour, maybe 2 hours at a time. But think about what you're doing in the group. You're actually having them identify what they're thinking to change that thinking. So if I'm low risk, and I'm sitting here and I'm hearing all this high-risk antisocial attitudes coming out, and we know that the period of adolescence, who's more important? Peers than adults. And over again, I'm hearing all these peers say that over and over. I'm going to start picking up on some of those attitudes, and attitudes drives behaviors. So we want to make sure we keep low and high separate. We usually see this when we talk about violating the risk principle. Low-risk kids get too much. They get too much supervision and programming. You do not want that to happen. Why? 2 things. One, at best, you will get no reductions in recidivism. But then there's a whole concept of wasting space. Okay? And y'all said you didn't have a whole lot of money. But also, what typically happens is that we can actually make the kids worse. And you know, if you think about it, what we're looking at is the concept of do no harm. So we want to make sure that those low-risk kids, we do not harm them. Now, also when we talk about violating the risk principle, another way that we violate it is when we're looking at the high-risk kids. And with high-risk kids, what that means is that we usually don't give them enough. We don't give them enough supervision, and we don't give them enough programming. What that means is that, for example, we may have a high-risk kid and only give them 2 or 3 hours of programming at best. Is that going to be enough to actually change those risk factors? No, because you probably had 15 years of the teaching of those risk factors, the showing of the risk factors. So that's looking at the risk principle. We want to make sure that we actually target those high-risk kids and we give them enough supervision, enough programming. The third principle we're looking at is what we call need/treatment principle. And with that, we want to make sure that we target the things that will change criminal behavior. If you'll notice the blue box at the end, a much stronger relationship with reductions in recidivism if we target the criminogenic needs versus if we just making them afraid of punishment. If we try to bond them together, if we target their self-esteem, if we just work them out physical activity, we actually see slight increases in recidivism. So we know that criminogenic needs very important when it comes to actually reducing the criminal behavior of the youth. And that's going to lead us to the treatment principle. Again, we know supervision alone is never going to change behavior. We have to do something with the kid. But now it's not just enough just to sit down and talk to them, because they've had speeches all their life. What we want to make sure is that we actually teach them skills. And this is coming from the theories, the successful treatment approaches. We have family-based therapies, FFT, MST, social learning, cognitive behavioral, radical behavioral, and then the theories that target specific criminogenic needs such as sexual behavior, substance abuse, serious mental illness. We want to make sure that what we're going to be doing is based and grounded in science. So what does this actually look like? Treatment principle. We want to make sure that we're restructuring their thinking, we're teaching them skills, we're using consequences and rewards, and then we're effectively modeling behaviors for them. Now when it comes to the restructuring, this is focusing on the antisocial attitudes. And y'all remember this model, A plus B equals C, correct? So the antecedent plus the behavior equals the consequence. That's the correct model. However, most kids like to think it's this. A equals C. It's the antecedent that equals the consequences, and their behavior had nothing to do with it. So what we're actually trying to teach them is this concept that thinking drives behavior, but even that is such an abstract concept, we have to break it down so they can see it and understand it. So we start with the situation, which leads to thoughts, which leads to feelings, which leads to behavior, which leads to the consequences. Now, we've used this quite a while out in Kansas to actually get the kids to realize, you know what, at most of these points in time, we can teach you skill so that you can, one, avoid the situation, so you won't have the risky thoughts that won't lead to risky feelings, that won't lead to the behavior. Or if you can't avoid the situation, then maybe you're in the situation and you start having risky thoughts, you can implement a thought blocker. So at any point in time, we try to work with the kids to actually use different tools. Some of the tools are thinking reports. How many of you all are familiar with thinking reports? Basically, it's a sheet of paper that has them list the situation and all the things that they were thinking and feeling at the time. And then we get them to identify the risk and the thoughts. And you do that over and over and over again, reinforcing it, and then hopefully they'll start to use that in the spur of the moment. Also, functional analysis. And functional analysis is almost like a relapse prevention plan, but doesn't have to necessarily focus on substance abuse. What we're doing with the functional analysis is getting them to assess situations, thoughts, and places, people, places, things, getting them to identify the thoughts and the feelings, and then before they happen, how are ways that they can either avoid them or cope with them. And then the last thing we use is a cost-benefit analysis. But here we don't just have them look at the pros and cons of the risky behavior, because a lot of times you'll see that there's a lot, for the kids, there'll be a lot more pros than cons for the risky behavior. We also get them to look at the pros and cons of the opposite behavior. And that's really where they can see on paper, yeah, there may be a lot of pros for this criminal behavior, but there's some negatives too. But if I do the pro-social behavior, there'll be a lot more pros and a lot less cons. So we get them to use the functional or the cost-benefit analysis really to focus on the consequences before they engage in the behavior. So that's the restructuring piece. How do we go about teaching the kids skills? Vastly important. Couple of things we want to do. First and foremost, we have to make sure our staff are trained in how to teach kids skills. We want to break each skill down to its important to the steps, and the staff actually model it in a very structured format. Then next we have the kids role play. Every kid in the group will role play that skill, and then you provide feedback and reinforcement. When it comes to reinforcements, vastly important. Reinforcements help to maintain behavior. What we're looking at here, rewarding. How many of y'all actually have some type of reinforcement system that you use with the kids? How many of you all have a reinforcement system that includes more rewards than punishers or sanctions? Okay, it drops down. We see that usually very often in corrections. But really, we know to truly change behavior, you have to reinforce it. You have to reward the behavior more often than punishing it. But that doesn't mean that we just let the antisocial or the risky behavior go by the wayside. We still address it. But what it means is that we actually sometimes have to look for things to reinforce, to positively reinforce. Also, we want to make sure that any reinforcements that we do, whether it's the rewards or the sanctions, are done immediately, so that the kids can actually more likely to tie it to the behavior. But then we want to make sure that we link that reinforcement back to the behavior. As simple as a minute, 2-minute conversation with the kid. What were you thinking at the time that you did the behavior, whether it's a good behavior or risky behavior? How did that help you with this consequence, whether it's a reward or whether it's a sanction? And then also explore what they could do in the future, because if they don't have the skills, they'll continue to engage in that same behavior over and over again. And then other effective characteristics, not necessarily within the risk-need responsivity model, but these are characteristics that research has shown is going to be important. Making sure that we disrupt the relationships, looking at the peers, we disrupt those delinquent relationships, and help them build natural supportive relationships. Working with the family. Now when we're looking at reentry, kids are locked up, and usually I hear this. With the correctional staff, I hear, well, you know what, it's not my job to work with the family. With the supervision staff, I hear, well, the kid's locked up, there's no use in working with the family. But what we really want to see is that true seamless system, so that while the kid is locked up, we're working with the kid, teaching them skills, but at the same time, someone's working with that family member and teaching the family member skills as well, so that when the kid is released back into the community, the family's ready to receive the youth. So working with the family member, also maintaining contacts with the family while the kid is locked up. Intensity of the intervention should be conducive to the level of risk. Provide for the continuum of care. Truly, if we're working with the kids, we can't wait until the last minute and then try to throw everything at them at once. They'll sort of just regurgitate it back and it won't stick. So we got to make sure that we start working with them in the beginning and it follows them out to the community. Making sure that we have a workforce that's skilled and working with the kids and working with them on how to actually teach the skills, how to get them to change their thinking. Adhering to program fidelity so that we actually start to measure ourselves and see, you know, am I reducing the level of risk of the youth? Am I meeting their criminogenic needs, even their non-criminogenic needs? And then making sure that we have stable resources, because we know that stability is important when it comes to actually working with this population. And then the last principle we're looking at is responsivity. I can tell you right now, out of the risk need responsivity, this is the hardest to actually implement effectively. What this means, how many of y'all have said, you know what, we do individualized care? How many of y'all actually do individualized care for the kids? That is truly specific responsivity, when we're actually taking each individual youth and looking at what are the drivers, what needs do they have. Responsivity, what we know. This is looking at things such as motivational level, mental health, maturity level, demographics, even their IQ. So I may have, this whole group right here may be all high-risk youth, but let's just say this gentleman doesn't want to be here. You don't want to be here, okay? You are immature. Okay? And you're immature as well, since you're sort of smirking at him, okay? And a couple of them have low IQs. So, you know, I can still do all those things that we've talked about, but for example, with you and you who don't really want to be here, you may actually go through some pre-treatment stuff. And really with pre-treatment, all we're getting you all to do is to see that you might really need to change. Whereas they just want to change, but they can't sit still long enough. Okay, their low maturity level, you know, maybe even ADHD, they can't sit still. And so would they be great putting them in a group for an hour? No, absolutely not. So that's where responsivity comes into play. You have to know the characteristics of the kids, and then we work what we say to match them. So you either match them to staff or match them to program characteristics based upon these characteristics. And then just in summary, what we're looking at here, the risk principle is going to tell us who we need to target. The need principle, remember we're looking at those criminogenic needs. It's going to tell us what we need to target for the moderate to high risk kids. The treatment principle tells us how do we go about doing it. So we're changing their thinking and we're teaching them skills. We're also working with the family members. Responsivity also tells us how we go about targeting. So we're going to remove those individual barriers that they may have. So for example, the kids who are unmotivated. It doesn't mean just because you don't want to be here that I'm not going to make you stay in the group. You just may have to do some other things up front. We may work with you individually to start to get you motivated to change. Those who have ADHD, you know, we may not make them sit through an entire hour group of 45 minutes. So we're looking at those individual characteristics. And then fidelity. How well are we doing it? Making sure that we have performance measures in place. Making sure that we actually are reassessing the risk of the youth. Making sure that we're looking at, are we reducing their criminogenic needs? Okay. And then this is just another way of looking at risk need responsivity. So we have the risk needs evaluation. Also, we want to make sure that we have evaluations on functional impairment. And then ongoing multidisciplinary assessments. So assessment is going to be our cornerstones. These are the things that actually we use to tell us who do we want to be targeting and what do we want to be targeting. They're going to help us make better decisions. What do we do with these youth? How many of y'all actually have, in your jurisdictions, they actually use some type of risk assessment prior to sentencing the kids? Very good. So, I mean, that's a great place to start using risk assessments prior to sentencing so that the judge has that information to know. Hopefully, we'll prevent the low-risk kids from getting, locked up. Case management strategies, programming or clinical treatment planning, supervision levels, transition and reentry planning, making sure, again, that we're doing those ongoing assessments, because if we've had kids who've been locked up for a while, we want to make sure that we're doing the assessments so that it will have the most recent information when it comes to reentry planning, all going to be leading to community safety and the reduction of recidivism for the kids. Okay?
Just a couple of summary comments. The first, I suspect that some of you, as you're hearing the description of some of these youth, are thinking, but there are kids that I see that don't exhibit these traits. Absolutely. Absolutely. There are lower risk kids. Not every young person in the system exhibits these traits, but moderate and higher risk kids do. I'm also willing to bet that in many of your programs, the ones that you're saying, I see kids different than this, I'm willing to bet that in many of your programs, the treatment that you're providing them, the programming that you're providing them, is the exact same programming that you're providing the treatment or programming to the other level of risk of kids. So one of those levels of youth is getting, if you will, somewhat ineffective programming. Some of you are probably thinking, but I have to take whoever's sent to me. I don't get to choose. And I understand that, which is part of why we are embarking on this, because it can't be on your backs alone. There has to be something broader at a policy level to really think about and look at. How are we doing this? How are we making decisions about where young people go, what kinds of interventions they get, and how we respond to them? Now, some of you may be thinking, my job is not recidivism reduction. How dare you talk about that? It's improving the young person's life. That's what I'm about. Well, it is absolutely what we should be about. But somebody would have to explain to me how it is that somebody getting arrested again and again and again is improving their life. And so, unless you can show me that what you're doing is lessening the likelihood of them getting rearrested or recommitted or replaced in a residential setting, then the very thing you say you want to do, I'm going to argue, is not being effectively done. And then some of you are probably thinking that, but there's other things that are important to do with these young people besides the things that Dr. Peeler's just mentioned, and you're absolutely right. There are clearly other things to do with young people in terms of improving the quality of their life, but not instead of accurate risk assessment, not instead of responding to the criminogenic needs, but in addition to or alongside responding to those things. And finally, some of you may be thinking that this would mean a major retooling of my program or of my whole system, and indeed it might, which is why our commitment is to attempt to focus at this at a policy level, why our commitment is to really over the course of the next year or two bring significant leaders in terms of legislation and policy together to be able to think about how to change this at a level that as folks are coming into your programs, you are able to get the right youth to connect to the right programming that you can provide in the right way. And in essence, you not have to make up for the fact that whoever comes to you, and there's no logic about how that happens in terms of programming needs. And finally, it is also clear that funders and legislators at both the state and federal levels are demanding outcomes that are translated into people both effectively and successfully getting out of the system and staying out of the system. And that translates once again into recidivism reduction. And when we talk about recidivism reduction, we don't just mean not going back to a juvenile center. We mean not having to be placed again outside of the home. not being removed from one's family again, not going to short-term incarceration of whatever type. So when we talk about recidivism reduction, we don't just mean not going back to a state facility, but all of those things that disrupt a young person's lives, that disrupt the flow of their lives, and disrupt the opportunities that they have for successful living as they move into adulthood. Again, thank you so much for